Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Real Estate Guys. You're here with Sean Johnston in Billings, Montana. We've got Alan Jacobson from Palm Garden, Florida with us today, as well as Trip Dunman. So I always get your last name backwards.
You got it right, Dudman.
I got it actually right for once.
Yep.
Dunman out of Kansas City. And today we're talking about inspections again. Last week we talked about inspections with regards to buyers, and today we're going to talk about how sellers might consider to approach the issue of home inspections, either prior, boy, I'm really having a hard time talking today, prior to listing the house, as well as while you're in the process of being under contract with a buyer. So I think I'm going to hand it off to Trip because he has some interesting forms in his state that I find intriguing. And so he's going to start off by talking a little bit about as is, and we might chime in a little bit because I think we all have a little bit of an opinion on that one. So go ahead,
Yeah.
Trip.
Thanks, Sean. So good afternoon, everyone. So in the two states that I am licensed in and sell homes, Kansas and Missouri, both states have a provision in our multiple listing service where we can sell a home, what we call as is or in its present condition, meaning the same thing. The in its present condition in our market is actually negotiated often up front when an offer is submitted. And that's documented by a standalone one-page in its present condition addendum with three boxes, three choices with differing risks and liabilities per each box. And our in its present condition addendum, box one is the buyer has the right to conduct an inspection, does not have a right to ask for any repairs, and does have the right to terminate the contract within the inspection window. Box two, a little better for the seller, a little less so for the buyer, says that they can conduct an inspection, they cannot ask for repairs, and they cannot back out of the contract during the inspection window. And then, of course, the last, and the sellers in one sense really like this, and another sense it's got a broader risk to it, but is box three. And box three says that the buyer waives all rights to even have an inspection. So clearly no repairs and no backing out. It's just no inspection at all.
So can I
And
ask a question? Do you mind if I chime in?
yeah, please do.
Because that was really interesting. I hadn't heard that before. So box two says they can do an inspection, but they don't have the right to back out, right?
Correct.
What's the point of doing an inspection?
It's more for the new homeowner's knowledge of if there are any issues, um, or things they need to address as they become the new owner. But they know up front if they accept that box, they really want the house. And often when that's used from at least their visual showing of the house, they feel like it's a pretty solid house to begin with. Usually this is not done on, it can be done on investment properties because if an investor's buying, they tend to have the wherewithal to address issues. But when you're talking about a primary homeowner that's moving into a home and going to live there, they tend to be a little more cautious and careful. And when they check that box, what I've found, at least over the last year or so, is that box is often more checked when there's a multiple offer situation. So it's not always necessarily just the quality of the house, it's to win the offer, they will check that box. Now, I mentioned the box three as kind of sounds good to the seller. Longer term, it's potentially greater liability in case that buyer finds something that was not disclosed earlier on that probably could have been revealed in an inspection. When both parties waive that right, or at least the buyer waives that right to do an inspection, what are the ramifications down the road? So what I don't typically advise my buyers or sellers to do box three. because you're in a situation that, in my mind, a good seller wants to leave a good house to the buyer. They don't want to do the wrong thing and kind of pull things over on them. And as such, an inspection gives both parties a sense of comfort that at least they performed the due diligence required, and didn't just overlook that. Now, once again, in this multiple offer arena we were in, that was often the box that won. The seller would pick that because, obviously then they're not exposed to anything inspection wise. So those are the three boxes. Now, one last thing before I turn it over to Alan, and that is, even if the buyer checks box one and signs the in its present condition up front in the offer, we can't assume in our markets that all buyers/buyers agents will not still ask for something. And usually you see it on like major dollar ticket items, such as, oh, the roof needs to be replaced, or a new HVAC system, or something that's pretty large dollar and ticket item. But just today I was sharing with the guys ahead of this call that I was pretty convinced that a buyer that turned in their resolutions of unacceptable conditions today was going to do that, and they kind of surprised me. They said, no, we're honoring what we wrote, and I can really respect that, and didn't ask for repair. So that's always a positive when that occurs. But the point of my bringing that up is it's always important when you got that sort of paradigm to explain that to the sellers up front to manage expectations. So they know that it's a possibility, even if the document was signed, that could happen, that the buyer could ask for repairs, even though they had agreed to that up front not to. So with that, Alan, I'll flip it over to you, and I think you'll take this a whole different arena.
Okay, thank you. So, to your point about comfort, very important for both parties to feel comfortable. So you have a contract, and of course there's oftentimes a negotiation on the contract, and sometimes it can get a little emotional, sometimes not so emotional. But funny thing is that the inspection can actually be even more emotional, because the seller, they've now agreed on a price. And in their minds, no matter what their listing agent may have told them, or no matter what they may perceive, that's the price. That's it. So let's say, hypothetically, you have a home that's $500,000 and they agree to a price of $475,000. In the seller's mind, they've now given the buyer $25,000. They're selling it for less. Now, all of a sudden, the inspection comes back and the buyer is asking for this and that to be fixed, or they're saying, well, we'd like a $10,000 credit. Well, the seller's saying to themselves, wait a second, we gave them $25,000 off. Why do we have to give them more? So it becomes a surprise to many sellers. What can oftentimes work to the seller's benefit from an emotional point of view in particular, but also for maybe presenting a better home that doesn't present itself the same way in an inspection, is to get a pre-inspection of the home, so that you know in advance that, okay, the roof has some flashing, has a couple tiles that are cracked that need to be fixed, that maybe there's a little insulation that needs a little something, or a couple outlets need to be covered. I mean, as simple as that. So they do some minor repairs, and now they have a little peace of mind knowing that they're going into it in a different position than all of a sudden, like this whammy, like, oh my God, why are they asking me for more? I've already given them. One example I have right now is I have a listing that, and unfortunately, we had an offer on it, and a buyer had their inspector, met with their inspector, and the inspector failed the roof because of a spray foam underneath the roof, which insulates the home. And he came up with some cockamamie story about what it does to the roof and how it makes the home hotter, this or that, freaked out the buyer, and the buyer canceled the contract. And I had said to the buyer, because it was an unrepresented buyer, I said, listen, let's get another inspection. Let's get 2 inspections. Let's get a roof inspector, not a general inspector who doesn't get into the weeds and have the same knowledge as a roofer. Well, he and his wife talked about it, and they were freaked out. Well, we had a roof inspector come, a very highly esteemed roof inspector, and there was $2,900 worth of damage. Meanwhile, the other one told the buyer, oh, you're going to have to replace it. It's going to cost $80,000 to $100,000, and he basically killed the deal. So we went in, we got the roofer $2,900, we had it fixed, and now we know we don't have a problem. So I think it's really helpful to get a pre-inspection of a home in advance for peace of mind, if nothing else. Sean?
No, I think just to roll off of that, we talked about owner's property disclosures, and so I would agree with both of you. This is actually a very interesting topic. So, and it sounds like all of us have had some interesting experiences just recently on it. So I know in my case, in Montana, we just instituted a new ruling last October where owner's property disclosures are required to be provided to buyers by anyone selling a home, whether they're represented by a real estate agent or not. And so prior to that, it was, if you wanted to provide one, great, buyer could ask for it. You didn't have to provide it. And what my team has always told everybody is our listings, people that are selling their home, that it's wise to prepare in advance for these things and to the best of their ability, disclose any adverse material facts. I always tell them, if you were buying this home, what would you want you to tell you? And so, if you were selling it to yourself, what would you want to know? What do you wish you would have known when you bought it from the previous seller that maybe you've learned? And put that information in the owner's property disclosure so that number one, the buyer can look at it and it will help them make a determination on whether they want to move forward with the deal. It will also give them something to work from when they do their home inspection. And like Alan was saying, if you've already done a pre-inspection, then maybe you'll know some of these things in advance, either address them before you even go live, or be able to say, this will be repaired prior to closing. But also, once the buyer's read that owner's property disclosure and you have disclosed any adverse material fact, you have disclosed it, they've accepted it, everybody's signed it, and you've limited your liability as a seller dramatically. It doesn't mean that you're never going to have anything come back on you in real estate. That's a whole nother video conversation. I can talk about some of the things that happened to me back in the day when I was first involved in investing in real estate. But the inspection process between buyer and seller, as Alan was saying, it can become very emotional, and that's typically what I've experienced. So if you're a seller listening to this conversation, I think that's the big takeaway is think about those things. Hopefully you have an agent, you're working with an agent that is competent, who is experienced enough to know to have these kinds of conversations with you in advance while you're in the process of getting your home on the market. Also, when you're in the process of accepting offers or looking at offers, so that, as Alan was saying, when somebody asks you for a reduction in the purchase price, that you realize that may not be the end of the reduction, or at least in what the buyer is going to ask for. with regard to a reduction. We just went through one recently where the buyer came in, less than what we expected our seller to accept from us, or from a buyer, and they chose to go into that contract. And we just got done with inspection yesterday, and the buyer's asking for more. Not hugely more, but more. And it is an emotional conversation at that point. That was that way when we bought it, as one I've heard many, many times. I don't know what their problem is. I bought it that way. Why wouldn't they buy it that way? And so having those conversations early on in the process with your agent, if you're an agent watching this, taking the time to have those kind of conversations with your sellers so that they're well prepared for those conversations in advance is always going to be better. And so, yeah, I think that's what I want to cover. Just given the 5-minute warning, so we're doing better than most people.
Let me just give one quick example that I was
All right.
discussing with you guys before, so everybody knows. So I sold a home recently that had a 25-year-old roof. And if I can tell you that the sellers were freaking out because they knew that there were other homes, similar homes in the community that had brand new roofs, and they didn't. They had their original roof, and typically the lifespan of that kind of roof in Florida is 30 years. So, and insurance companies oftentimes will not insure a home based on the age of a roof. So they were really so nervous for the longest time. And I said, listen, let's get a pre-inspection of the roof. Let's see what the inspector has to say. It cost them $150. That's it. Inspector came back and said, you know what? The roof's in good condition and it's got about 5 years left on it. I cannot tell you how much better they felt from that little bit of information at such a minimal cost to them. So yeah, it at times can be very valuable depending on what we're looking at, whether it's a roof or an old air conditioning system, hot water heater. Those are some of the bigger items. But yeah, I think this was a great conversation, guys.
You mentioned, Alan, the kind of the peace of mind comfort level, and this comment dovetails from that, just in a little different way. Our broker will often say in our meetings, when you're talking to a seller about populating the seller's disclosure, be very transparent and overly disclose. You never can disclose too much and put yourself in a bad situation. But here's and I tell my sellers that I think that's a good driving philosophy. But here's the subtlety that comes from it is, as you notice various sellers disclosures in our states out there, you can tell a little bit about the sellers by how methodical they are and how they've populated that, how clean it is, what's been maintained, what's broken, what was repaired, and their level of detail that they go into. They actually put concerted time into filling the seller's disclosure out. That gives some subtle comfort and peace of mind also to a buyer that they're like, oh, well, they didn't really have to even say anything about, a hairline crack in the garage floor, but they mentioned that means they're thorough. So it sends a lot of positive messages too, in how sellers actually communicate that message, to potential buyers.
Yep.
Completely agree with you. It's just, I've had that conversation numerous times in the last couple of months, and on both sides of the transaction. Hey, look, this seller really took the time to fill this out. Or honestly, the opposite way with a buyer, wow, well, the seller didn't really take any time to fill this out. Doesn't look like either their agent didn't share with them how important this is, or they just chose not to take the time to fill it out. So we're going to want to make sure that we do an inspection, and vice versa with sellers the same way. So I would agree with that thought process wholeheartedly. It's a very, very good indicator, I think. In fact, I spent the evening last night with one of my sellers, and we spent 20 minutes going through on a bare land piece of ground, even the owner's property disclosure on that, we took the time to make sure we filled in every blank and made sure that we answered all the questions. So that was a really good topic today, guys. I
Yep.
find, I don't know, sometimes I wonder how interesting these topics are to the average buyer or seller. They're always really interesting to us because we get to deal with this stuff every day. But anyway, we kind of geek out on some of this stuff.
Well, we're providing valuable information that they may or may not know. And that's why hopefully they're watching us and will hopefully enjoy the information we're giving and will then share, and tell people about our program, because I think we do provide a lot of great information.
I agree. And I,
The other thing I would add too is one of the things that I've observed throughout the times we've been doing this is that it's not the same everywhere. So there's a lot of similar thinking, but it manifests or plays out differently in each region, each state, each multiple listing service. And it's good to be, in my mind, exposed to the way other states do it. And maybe there's some good things that we can learn from that to, apply to our own market. So I think that's valuable as well.
Great.
I would really agree that it is very interesting. It's something, there's a quick takeaway and then we'll wrap this up. But the takeaway, I think, from what Tripp just said, that's really important for those that are watching is you may have, like in my case, when I came to Montana, I had, bought and sold 20 some properties at that point in my life and had an experience based on a state and the MLS there and the legalities there. And then when I came to Montana, completely different environment, totally different documents, completely different way of transacting a real estate transaction, even though many of the national law, or we have national laws that govern this industry, but we also have state laws. And I think a lot of people, well, most people wouldn't know that unless they had actually become a licensed real estate agent. So it's really valuable if you're transitioning from one state to another and you're going to go buy property in another state. It's going to be potentially a very different transaction than what you experienced in the previous state. So I think that's a really valuable takeaway from today's conversation. So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll go ahead and wrap this up. And as always, please like, share, subscribe, do all that good stuff. And we look forward to seeing you next week here on The Real Estate Guys. Take care.